Welcome back, artists. Today we are going to be creating our landscape, and we're going to be using placement and size to create the illusion of space in our landscape. You'll see I have my 9x12 paper in landscape mode. It's long on the bottom. And we are going to create a landscape that has a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Our items in the foreground will be bigger. Our items in the middle ground will be medium, and our items in the background will be small. Also, what we want to focus on is we are going to be having a very simple landscape, because when we paint this, it is going to be a monochromatic landscape that is also going to have different values or have a value scale. So our items in the front will be dark, our items in the middle will be lighter, and our items on the distance will get lighter and lighter and lighter. For this project, you need at least 3 different items that you're going to be placing in your landscape, whether those are trees or hills or mountains, to show your different sizes. And you could have more if you want, but the requirement is going to be 3. I'm going to draw my landscape in with a pencil first, and then I will show it to you up close. It will be hard to see on the video, but once I start painting, you'll be able to see the landscape come to life. Okay, artists, you'll see in the video where I drew the different kinds of trees. I've got my trees in the foreground that are big, my trees in the middle ground that are medium, and my trees, I even actually have 4 sets of trees that get smaller and smaller. So my trees in the middle ground are medium and a small, medium, small, and then my trees in the background are really small. Like I said, you can only have 3 if you want. I wanted to have 4, so I had a little bit more detail. And because this is going to be monochromatic, all one color with no details, I'm going to go ahead and erase the lines where my trees connect to the hills, just to give my painting a little bit more flow. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I actually start painting. I don't want a lot of these lines showing when I get ready to paint. So you do not have to do this. This is just my artistic choice. So I'm going to go in there and erase those lines. All right, now I'm going to be ready to paint. And remember, when we're creating a value scale and when we're creating a realistic looking landscape, our items closer to us, our items in the foreground, are going to be darker. And those items are going to get lighter and lighter as they move away from us. So this is where you can think about those value scales that we painted. For example, here is a value scale that I made using blue tempera paint. And so I could actually turn this value scale up. And this is a good representation of how my paint is going to need to look on my page. It's going to need to be darker up front. Okay, my trees in the front will be the darker color, and it will get lighter and lighter as I go into the distance. So as I get ready to paint, I am going to let all of you have your own individual tempera cake. That way your cake won't get mixed in with any other colors. And you also will have your own sponge and water. That way you can continue to use just your own color, and you don't have to worry about your color getting dirty or mixed in with any other color, since we're focusing on having a monochromatic or one color landscape. So if you remember when we made our value scales, the more paint you start out with on your brush, the darker it's going to be. So I'm just going to simply wet my brush, and I'm going to go ahead and load my brush with lots of paint to start out my foreground. So I always want to start darker, and then I can work my way up, and then I'll know how light I need to get in the background. So I'm going to load my brush, and I'm actually just going to start with my trees. And I'm going to apply this paint on very evenly and very thick to make it as dark as I possibly can and one even tone all across the foreground. And I will jump to a time lapse so you can see how I paint this. Okay, so you will see that in this painting, I used the tempera, and you can see how dry my tempera still is. I just wet the tip of my brush barely and picked up the paint. I used very little water, and I just kept layering it very carefully with very little water to get this really nice dark blue. So just like how we did when we made our value scales, I'm going to go in, and for each layer, I'm going to make it a little bit lighter just by making my tempera paint a little bit thinner. And when you have one of these trays like this, you can actually bring your brush over to the side, and you can kind of test out what thinness of paint you have on your brush, and you can thin it down even more. Okay, so that's why everybody's going to have their own tray, so that they have a place to be able to work with their own tempera cake, and they can get their value on their painting correct. And you'll see I can pick up more water, I can go to my sponge, I keep my brush somewhat dry, I don't want to flood my paper. Okay, and so now I'm going to go in and work on the next level of my painting by thinning the paint. It's always a good idea to go lighter, because you can always add paint later and make it darker, but you can't make it lighter. So it's better to start out light in these next layers. Okay, we know each layer, this layer has to be lighter than this. Then this layer will need to be lighter than this one, and so on. And I'm going to work my way all the way to the top of the page. And you can kind of look at a value scale to give you a good idea of where you need to be. All right, I'm going to jump into time lapse, and I'm going to paint the remaining layers. Okay, artists, you'll see in the video, I went through and I made each area or each part of my landscape, the foreground, middle ground, background, different values. And when I got to the very background, which was what I would consider the sky, I actually just used water out of my water cup. It was thinned down and had just enough color in it. You can see a little bit of a change. So you'll also notice I went in a few times with a Kleenex or a tissue, because in some of my areas, because I still had water in those areas, it picked up a little bit of the paint and I didn't want it there. And while it's still wet, you can kind of work that area. Now, if I wanted to, I can always go back right now after this front part has dried, and I could even make this front, the foreground, the trees here, I could make them even darker. But you want that to be pretty dry before you start trying to layer the colors, because when it's wet, you could actually put too much water and put a hole in your paper. But I am actually pretty happy with this. I can see a clear distinction. If I hold a value scale up here, now these are two different kinds of blues, but I've done pretty good. I have darker, lighter, 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 until I have almost white on the front. Now, once again, this is a monochromatic landscape, and so we're using one color. That's what the prefix mono means, one, and we're making it a value scale with our darker values in the front all the way to our lighter values in the background.